Hey guys, welcome back. So in the last segment we talked about grounding, we talked about bringing in earth and cosmic energy. So now we're going to dive into the layers of the aura and give you kind of an option to play off of as far as interpretation, but by all means, if you feel like something else is a little bit different than what I'm about to say, then trust that. I'm not here to play this game of I know all of the things. This is something I was taught. This is how I tend to read people when I do the layers of the aura reading. And it just kind of works. It tends to give an overall picture of what's going on in this person's space. So even if it doesn't ring true for you, then trust that. So without further ado, I would like to explain a little bit about the chakras. So if you've never heard that word before, the chakras are energy centers in the body. You have many of them, but we're taught to kind of look at just the 7 basic ones that run through the body. But I also like to kind of say hello to the ones in the palms and in the center of the feet, because those are important as well. I mean, all of them are clearly important, but when we're looking at the layers of the aura, just to simplify the learning experience, we're just going to stick to the 7 today, the main 7. So you have chakra centers that are like moving energy portals in the body. So they circulate energy, and sometimes they get really clogged, kind of like a filtering system, and they become much slower. So instead of spinning in their normal pace, maybe they're going, and that can manifest physically. It can slow you down, it can cause anxiety, it can mean that you have a lot of pain in a particular area. So it can manifest in a lot of different ways. Also really hard to have clarity. So what we're going to do is, as we're kind of reading the layers of the aura, we can create more momentum in that chakra, because the chakra, so the energy center, is actually like a projector for the aura. So if we know that there's 7 main chakras that we're going to discuss today, then we're also going to take a look at the 7 layers that are created like a projector screen from those chakras. So these layers around the aura contain a lot of different information about you, and they contain a lot of different information about all the energy that's floating in your space. So it also is pointing at the place in your body where it's stemming from. So if I see something in the 4th layer of your aura, then I know that I also need to look at the 4th chakra in the body. And as I kind of say hello to one, or look at and give my attention to, so I say saying hello, but really that's just putting my attention on it. As I look at that, it starts to kind of move the energy in that chakra. So they correspond together, they work together, and I like to sort of look at it as like this projector screen idea, because really, if you work something in the layers, when you come back to the chakras and you kind of look at them, they usually are spinning much more soundly. And it's also kind of interesting to notice that sometimes the chakras spin counterclockwise when they are releasing something, and then they spin clockwise when they're filling back up with your own energy. Because whenever we remove energy, we also want to replace it with good stuff. So the first layer, so the first chakra is your root chakra. It's at the base of your spine. It creates the first layer of your aura, which is actually the one that's closest to your body. And so this one can be many different colors. There's no right or wrong color that it should be, but depending on what's going on in your life and certain themes that are playing out, it can have a lot of different information. So this is also where the grounding cord connects out of your body. So usually when you look at this layer, you kind of get a sense of somebody either being a very grounded person or maybe having trouble grounding. Maybe people are grounding through them. And it has a lot to do with your physicality, so your actual body, and whether you're having your needs met on a material level. So this is where I usually find information about a little bit about family, your home dynamic, maybe about your house, your car, things like that. And so because it's so close to our body, it really affects us. So it's interesting to just kind of know that. Another thing that's interesting about this layer is it can really say a lot about our physical health. So this is also the chakra and the layer where You start to notice if maybe there's some pain in the physical body, maybe there's an illness that used to be in the body that no longer is, and there's just fragments of the memory of it. Maybe it's a current illness. So there's a lot as far as everything that relates to your physicality. I could go a lot more into this, but I feel like I want to get to all 7 of the layers in this video, so I'm going to kind of just speed through them. So your second chakra is in your sacral center. So it has a lot to do with our emotions, and it also has to do with our sexuality. So how we're using that power of our sexuality, or maybe it's lack thereof, maybe there's a suppression going on, maybe we're having some really intense emotions. So this second layer is where you're going to see a lot of that information. Oftentimes you find a little bit of family energy in there, a little bit about when you were a child, certain things that were programmed into your body. You know, maybe you were a really sensitive child and you cried a lot and your parents were really uncomfortable with that, or maybe one particular parent, and so you kind of shut down your emotional center. And it's not that your needs aren't there, but it's that in a method of protecting yourself, you closed it off a little bit. So there's a lot of who you were in this layer as well, in your childhood experiences. Maybe there was abuse, if there's a lot of pain through like an abortion or a pregnancy that was really intense. Maybe your baby ended up being born, but it went through some intense period of fear or things like that. That all shows up here really strongly. There's anything around being suppressed as far as your ability to operate as an empowered individual in the world. So that could be you currently, it could be you as a child. Sexual power, let's say. So it doesn't mean that it's this overtly sexual projection or manifestation, but it could mean that having an air of confidence about yourself at one point or another became threatening for somebody who didn't quite have that, or was faking their way to have it, and it wasn't a genuine feeling. So when they sensed it in you, they throw energy at it to kind of shut it down because they're not ready to heal that aspect of themselves. So a lot of sexual trauma, things like that show up in this layer. Oftentimes when you really look at it, there's a lot of that kind of information of times where you were not allowed to be you because it was too much, or your emotions, people didn't know what to do with them. And so it's a very complicated, very deep layer to work through, and it's often where some really deeply personal stuff comes up for people. So I'm always kind of checking in, from like a professional space of whether people are really ready to hear what I'm seeing, because sometimes I'll see something and I get this sense that, almost like a feedback that they're not quite ready to have the language around that. I'll just kind of send it a little bit of a healing, send it a little bit of an acknowledgement so they can start to let it go on a subconscious level, but I don't always bring it up in language. It depends on the person who's in front of me. Especially if I'm reading somebody who's like under the age of 18, I don't always like to really just dive in deep to some perhaps like sexual trauma that they endured or something that feels just extremely deeply personal. So I am just really mindful of when it feels appropriate to bring those things up. And more often than not, people can have the information. I just feel like there doesn't need to be a lot of language for somebody to experience the healing on it. I can just see it on a spiritual level, on a clairvoyant level, and I can give it the healing that it needs in that moment, and it's enough. So I've learned to really trust that not everything needs to be vocalized. I'm not trying to trigger that person into something that it doesn't feel like they're quite ready to dive into. So sometimes I'll just plant the seeds, is what I like to say, and I'll just, gently say, oh, there's some, what looks like some sexual trauma here. We're just gonna kind of let that be and start to move some of that out. Or maybe I'll just say trauma, not use the word sexual. Depends on the person. So trust your inner guidance that, oh, this feels like I'm pushing it. Then, you know, you'll learn as you practice. And certainly when you're doing it with yourself, you can dive into the truth of those things. But as far as reading other people goes, I'm much more gentle in this layer. And, you know, honestly, I think it's important to say that relationships come up really strongly in this layer. Past relationships, current relationships, the dynamics we have with our parents. But a lot of like love partnership stuff shows up really strong here as far as the way that the foundation of the relationship is working. So even though maybe on the surface those people are saying, you know, oh, I'm generally really happy in my relationship, and you know, we've been together for a long time and we've learned how to just work around our differences. But if at any point that relationship has required them to kind of dim their power to sort of camouflage and make that partner feel like they're really powerful, or maybe you've learned through your own sensitivities that if you talk about certain subjects with them, they get really emotional and angry, and then you have to kind of manage that. So really you start to back off of ever discussing those things or ever bringing them up, and you just learn how to almost pretend like it doesn't happen, or you learn how to cope on a different level, because really you're trying to protect yourself from having to manage those explosive situations. So that's where a lot of that stuff shows up in somebody's second layer. Because it's all the ways in which you've restricted yourself from displaying like your true power, who you are as a being. So there's a lot of ways that we view power as like an action-based, creation tool, but really you operating from your true vibration is a power. And I see that strongly in the second layer as far as what you are capable of versus what you are able to emanate out into the world, and how much you're able to access that layer. Also, it's important to mention that this is actually the house in which your creative energy sits. A lot of us get suppressed from our own creative energies, and so they sit and they simmer in the lower aspects of us, when really our bodies are wanting to bring that creative energy up from the second chakra, up from the second layer into the higher aspects of our bodies. So that would be, you know, running through the heart, running through the throat, running through our third eye, where we get to visualize things and manifest, and then out through the crown, which is where we just have a lot of the powerhouse creative energies of who we are as a spiritual being. They get to meet this body. So it's not that we aren't capable of bringing that creative energy up. It's just that when we have our attention on that and we start to direct the flow a little bit more, we work through all those blocks and all those layers that are prohibiting us from having that free-flowing energy. And that's where manifestation really kicks up a notch. That's where we have these aha moments and these beautiful abilities to just get through some really, you know, maybe turbulent or transitional times with creative power. And so we're just redirecting the flow of our own healing energy, our own creative power that is part of our birthright. So keep in mind that if it looks like there's just a ton of energy that's just overflowing here, that can manifest as somebody who's like hypersexual or has no permission to be sexual at all. You know, there's a lot of programming belief systems that show up here about like religion, and maybe something that came in from a past life is showing up here. So there's a lot of information we could go into. In fact, I'm probably gonna have to do a whole series just about that kind of stuff. So the third chakra is your solar plexus, and that exists about right here. It's kind of below, it's below the heart, it's above your navel, kind of in the center, which creates the third layer of your aura, which is about how you use your energy out in the world. So it's kind of your doing center. It's where your action of creating and manifesting out into the world, it's often the center that gets the most overwhelmed, the most worked in our day-to-day lives with societal programming that we have to keep go, do, stick to our routine. If we're not, you know, doing 100,000 things in one day, then we're failing, you know, so it has a pressure to it. And depending on how you operate in your reality as far as permission to relax, permission to really just be and not have to do, this layer can look really intense. And Even when you perhaps have a generally healthy routine, there's still parts that show up in this layer that have a lot to do with how we could continue to improve that, how we can continue to call a lot more of our energy back, and that it's okay for things to sort of run from more of an intuitive energy versus control, having to stay action-based belief systems that is really running rampant on our planet right now. So as far as just giving, some attention to that layer in those capacities, we start to call a lot of our energy back to us, look at how it's overstimulated, how maybe it's just totally bogged down because you've pushed it too far, got too far into overwhelm. Again, I see a lot of illness in this layer sometimes. I also see a lot of dietary things related in this layer, how we're using food and our diets to sustain us. Are we operating from a space that says that we should be doing this, and this versus what we actually want to be doing? So it's not even just about food, it's about like lifestyle. It could be about having strict routines and just feeling like you can't step out of that. There's a lot of fear that comes up in this layer, things that you're afraid to change, feeling disempowered in certain roles that you're playing as far as maybe, your work or whatever you do for a living, really identifying with that instead of having a sense of self, in addition to some of the roles that you play. So if you're a parent, this is where I usually see like the parent is so attached to the idea of being a parent and then so attached to whatever it is that they do for a living that there isn't a lot of other identity outside of that because they simply don't feel like they have the time or the energy to cultivate another bigger sense of self that also can show up to those roles. So there's a bigger magnitude of what you can be running and operating from in the body, but we don't always give ourselves permission to explore that. And so part of what I want to get into in some other videos is ways to really deprogram yourself from those belief systems so you can cultivate really healthy feelings for yourself. And and then in the end, you're a better employee, you're a better career-oriented person, you're a better parent because you do have that sense of self and you're not operating from this kind of, I gotta keep doing this and I gotta take care of them, and you're putting everyone else first. And it's so simple and easy to do in this society because we're programmed to believe that that's how we should operate. So it's about deprogramming that and just noticing what's true for you once you start to work through some of those energies. So in your fourth chakra, this is about your heart. And this also relates in the layers to affinity for yourself and affinity for others. So the love you have for yourself and the love you have for the rest of the world. So in this layer, there's a lot more about how much love you have to give and all the ways you are giving it to others and how you can start to cultivate more of that for you. Because almost every single person I read, including myself, is giving so much of that love away and isn't really getting a lot of their own love because we're just not really aware that that's something that we should be giving more attention to or directing the flow of. The love that we have versus the love that we're able to tap into shows up here. So maybe there's been some trauma in your life. Maybe there's blocks to you really feeling that intense emotion because something happened. And now you've got this block to the heart space because you're trying to kind of protect yourself on a subconscious level from feeling that pain again. But what you've essentially done is cut yourself off from your own love. A lot of it's subconscious, but if your body goes through some trauma and says, I don't want to feel that pain anymore, and you start to cut yourself off from all those bad feelings or negative feelings, then that means you can't have the opposite spectrum, which is joy, bliss, ecstatic happiness, excitement. You can't genuinely tap into those emotions unless you experience the negative ones, negative ones. So what happens is you start to reprogram your ability to look at emotions from a more neutral perspective, and it's like, it's okay for me to feel grief. It's okay for me to feel sadness. It's okay for me to feel fear, anger, betrayal, shame, guilt, all those things. It's okay for me to feel those things, but what I don't want is to get stuck there. So if I know that I get stuck there by not feeling it and resisting it, and that just makes it fester up in all the layers of my aura till I start to surrender to it. I might as well just let it sort of show me what it needs to show me, express what I need to express, let myself cry, let myself express it in whatever way I need to. Maybe I need to scream, maybe I need to shout, maybe I need to just have a day off where I just go into nature. There's no right or wrong way to move through an emotion. But what you have to do is let yourself experience that so you can actually access these higher points of forgiveness and gratitude and excitement and joy and happiness and all these things that you're really striving to have, but you can't have one without the other. So in this fourth layer is usually where I see people that are suppressing a lot of love. And usually there's a foundation that their body learned at some point that it wasn't safe to be so vulnerable and loving all the time, and so it learns to kind of close itself off. Or maybe things happen to you so your body thinks, you know, I don't deserve love. So there's worthiness pictures here. There's a lot of energy related to how you feel unworthy. There's also a lot of religious programming that shows up in this layer of how, you know, sometimes religions introduce and program us into believing that we are less than and we are servants, and so, you know, it kind of depends on cultural upbringings and things, and sometimes it's even past life information that shows up here. So the heart is really a big projector as far as showing us how we can operate from a more loving space for ourselves, and how that has a ripple effect of giving to others in a way that we're not feeling stretched thin all the time, giving. It becomes effortless when we truly are giving love to ourselves. We are more capable of giving love to others naturally when we fill ourselves up. The fifth layer is created from the throat chakra, and this layer has a lot to do with how you use your voice. It has a lot to do with communication in general. It's connected through the ear channels, so sometimes you'll see some correlation between like this whole area here, the throat and the ears. And to me, that usually points out some interesting sensory abilities that are going on as far as ability to hear spirit. So that layer can kind of show different symbols about voice and about hearing and communicating, and how it's been, you know, either blown open, like you have to constantly defend yourself, or maybe it's that you have it all internal and you're not allowed to outwardly express it, so it's like this big block is in your throat because you're really wanting to express it, but you don't feel like you can, or you don't know how, or there's things in your space that are saying don't do that. And so there's a lot there for people that can be really heavy, especially when we look at, you know, the inner voice. What is the inner voice really saying versus what is the outer expression of you capable of actually expressing safely, right? So there's all this fear that comes up in this layer of what would happen if I did say how I really feel. So there's things that happen where we wish that we would have communicated better. We wish that, you know, it would have been easier for us to be eloquent with our words and to express how we were really feeling, but we didn't do that in the moment. And then there's memory of those, like fragments of those moments and circumstances that kind of get stuck here, and they all compile up together and they create this bigger picture that really communicates how much the body and how much you really wish that you could express those, and because you couldn't, now you're punishing yourself a little bit because you weren't capable of doing it. So it's very much past related, and not so much about the present moment, because maybe going forward you feel more capable, but you're gonna hit all this old stuff about how incapable you are and how you shouldn't speak up, and how, you know, that will result in all this chaos if you do speak up, and then you're gonna have to put out all those fires. And so There's a lot of layers to communication that can be really heavy, very complex. You know, it kind of goes back to childhood again, a little bit about, you know, what happened when you were a kid and you would start to speak how you really felt. Were you celebrated? Were you encouraged? Did it get shut down? Was it, you know, kids can be there but they can't speak? You know, there's so much that happens. It could have even been like a teacher and not your parents. It could have been that at some point, you know, you said something that was true and people weren't ready to hear it. And so there's so much that gets suppressed that usually it's kind of exploding with information about communication. There's also really exciting layers there about how, you know, people who are perhaps really in alignment with what they kind of came here to do as far as feeling excited about what they're doing. So there's a lot of really openness in this layer for some people, fulfilling their highest excitement. And so that can show up like as a creative, you know, burst of energy coming out here. It can also be a little bit about somebody who maybe does a lot of healing through their throat. Maybe it's singing, maybe it's speaking, maybe it's about writing, because that's still a form of, you know, voice and communication and expression. And so there's really interesting ways that you can also see like the higher perspective. You can also see what people are really capable of and some past life information of how capable they really are, and they're kind of tapping into those old memories of like DNA codes in a sense that are getting activated, so you can have more free access to that. So you got to clear out some of the blocks so you can have these big openings and this energy that's available to you from your higher self. So the throat and communication center is really interesting to look at for people that are exploring their own intuitive abilities too, because I feel like this is where you see a lot of spirit guide information start to show up. Different spirit guides and sometimes some ancestors kind of like to chord in through the back of our throat here and give us pictures, give us some form of communication in many different facets. But I do feel like it tends to show up in this fifth layer quite strongly, depending on who you are and how you operate. There is a set of telepathic filters that sit at the base of your head, in between your head and your neck, and that tends to show up in this fifth layer as well, as far as how much you're aware that you're clearing things subconsciously, how you can kind of look at that more consciously so you can really release it. So it's not so much about effort as it is just saying, oh, I'm hanging on to this, it's time to let it go. Sometimes there's also a lot of lessons there to teach us too that we really want to bring conscious awareness to. You know, maybe it's a certain past life where you were kind of murdered for speaking your truth, and it's important that you have a little bit of clarity that happened so you can start to let go of the ways your body's trying to protect you from that happening again, but it's just not in present time. So the sixth chakra is your third eye. So that's right here in the center of your head. It's also where your pineal gland is at. And that has a lot to do with the projection of how you see the world, and also how you see yourself. Depending on how much permission or lack thereof you have to really have clarity there and see, this layer can kind of show how your perspective might be a little clouded. Maybe it's super clear because you really operate from this space a lot, and so each person's really different. But it's interesting to kind of compare this layer to your seventh chakra, which is above your head in your crown, and that's like your knowingness center. It's where you just kind of know things. It's where your higher self really gives you a lot of information with more of just a sudden burst of clarity, or a wisdom that just is kind of boom, there it is, you know. And so it sends in through that crown area. But that layer, so the seventh layer, has more to do with how the world sees you. So it's really cool to kind of take a look at the sixth and the seventh layer side by side, because the sixth would be how you see the world, and then the seventh is how the world sees you. And you can kind of see how sometimes your perspective is just off because you're looking at something through, you know, like a box, or maybe you're going through your life based off of this perspective that everything you've known up until now is all there is. And it's hard to sort of climb out of that into a more optimistic view that just because you've had all these experiences doesn't mean that that's all you're going to keep having over and over and over again. So sometimes in the sixth layer, I see a lot of information about how people are kind of in their own way and they can't quite see their own magnificence. And then the 7th layer has a lot more to do with like the spiritual realm. So it's all of that amazing, delicious, divine energy of how capable you truly are as a being versus a little bit more of how you see, okay, this is available to me, so I'm gonna settle for this. So there's no settling in the 7th layer. This is something that you have access to, you just forget, or you just don't see it that way. So it hits a lot of that self-sabotage, you know, and so if that showed up pretty strongly in all the other layers, then when you get to these layers, it's safe to say it's going to show up again. But it's really amazing to watch how quickly somebody's aura starts to shift when you start reading the layers. Sometimes the colors change like this, they let go of something when you bring attention to it, and then everything starts to just move around and you start to go, whoa, there was some really, you know, shadowy energy over here, maybe it was really gray or staticky, and now there's like a good flow to it and there's a new color coming in. And if you can't see any of those things, it's okay, because you can just sense this like relief, or maybe it's like, oh, I feel much more calm, or I feel a little bit more excited or optimistic about where I'm going. So the 6th and the 7th have a lot to do with where you're kind of creating from, how you're manifesting in the world. What's blocking you from seeing something that you've never had and then allowing yourself to actually receive that? And so a lot of it is that we don't even give permission to sit down and think about these things that we really want. Or maybe it's something that we're looking at so specifically, because there's those of us that are like really strong mental people, and it's not that that's a bad thing, but it gets out of balance with the emotional body. And so the emotional part of you is equal, should be balanced with the mental part of you. And if you are insisting on things having to be a certain way, then your control is too much. Start to really magnify the importance of bringing the emotions as a priority and bringing the emotions into balance so it can kind of catch up to where your mental body is overworking. So I think in the next couple videos here, we're going to touch more on that. So thanks for sticking around. If you are interested in learning how to really read things in the different layers of the aura, we're going to really dive into creating your own symbolic library. So when you see certain images or you feel certain things, you can start to discern what that means for you, because your body is like a filter and you are tapping into information and then interpreting it. So really doing readings or doing any form of healing session, there's an interpretation going on. And for you, certain symbols might show up different than for me. I might interpret them a little bit differently than you. So I'm not going to give you a set of symbols that are the right way or the wrong way, but I want to touch on how you can learn to really develop those and give yourself a lot of confidence in doing it. Because the validation is really important for you to continue building and trusting yourself and letting go of things that really are blocking you from embodying that power that you have. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!
But for right now,
right below, like right in between, I don't remember what I was saying. Layer